A little girl donated blood to a man, not knowing he was a CEO and that she would inherit everything. If the title touched your heart, just imagine what's coming next. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and tell us where you're watching from. The fluorescent lights of Denver General Hospital buzzed overhead as 7-year-old Madison Carter pressed her small face against the cold glass window of the pediatric ward. Her golden hair caught the harsh light as she watched the bustling activity in the hallway below. The orphanage had brought her here for her routine medical checkup, but something felt different today. "Maddie, come away from the window," called Mrs. Henderson, the stern-faced woman who ran Sunset Hills Children's Home. Her voice carried the usual note of impatience that made Madison's stomach twist with familiar anxiety. "Yes, ma'am," Madison whispered, her small hands leaving foggy prints on the glass as she reluctantly stepped back. At 7 years old, she had learned not to argue with Mrs. Henderson. 3 years at the orphanage had taught her that much. Dr. Patricia Morris entered the examination room with a warm smile that immediately put Madison at ease. Unlike Mrs. Henderson, Dr. Morris always looked at her with kind eyes that reminded Madison of her mother before the car accident that changed everything. "How are we feeling today, sweetheart?" Dr. Morris asked, kneeling down to Madison's eye level. The gesture made the little girl's heart flutter with something she rarely felt anymore, being seen, being important. "I'm okay," Madison replied softly, swinging her legs from the examination table. Her worn sneakers, a size too small, barely made a sound as they bumped against the metal base. "Dr." Morris began her routine examination, but halfway through, her expression grew serious. She excused herself and returned with another doctor, Dr. James Carter, no relation to Madison, despite sharing her surname. They whispered in hushed tones, occasionally glancing at the little girl with expressions she couldn't quite read. "Madison." "Doctor," Morris said gently, sitting beside her on the examination table. "We need to talk to you about something very important. There's a man upstairs who is very sick, and we think you might be able to help him." Madison's blue eyes widened with curiosity and concern. "Help him? How?" "He needs blood, and you have a very special type of blood that could save his life, but only if you want to help. No one will make you do anything you don't want to do." Mrs. Henderson shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "Doctor, surely there are other options." "Madison is just a child, and I have concerns about—" "The decision is Madison's to make," Dr. Morris interrupted firmly, her protective instincts for her young patient clear in her voice. Madison looked between the adults, feeling the weight of their expectations, but in her heart there was no hesitation. Her parents had always taught her to help others when she could. Even though they were gone, their lessons lived on in her generous spirit. "Will it hurt him if I don't help?" she asked quietly. "He might not make it through the night," Dr. Morris answered honestly, respecting the child's right to understand the gravity of the situation. Madison nodded slowly, her small chin set with determination that belied her age. "Then I'll help him. My mommy always said we should help people when they need it." The blood donation procedure was carefully explained to Madison in terms she could understand. Despite her young age, she remained remarkably calm throughout the process, holding Dr. Morris's hand and asking questions about the man she was helping. "What's his name?" Madison asked as the nurse prepared the needle. "His name is Richard Sterling," Dr. Morris replied. "He's been sleeping for a very long time, and the doctors are hoping your help will wake him up." "Like Sleeping Beauty, but backwards?" Madison asked with innocent curiosity. Dr. Morris smiled, despite the gravity of the situation. "Something like that, sweetheart." As Madison's blood began flowing through the tubes that would carry it to the man fighting for his life 3 floors above, she felt a strange sense of connection to this stranger. She closed her eyes and whispered a prayer her mother had taught her, asking for the man to get better. Meanwhile, in the intensive care unit, Richard Sterling lay unconscious, surrounded by machines that monitored his every heartbeat. The 48-year-old CEO of Sterling Technologies had been found collapsed in his downtown office 2 weeks ago, the victim of a rare blood disorder that had suddenly and aggressively attacked his system. Richard had no family to sit by his bedside. No wife, no children, no siblings to hold vigil during the long nights when his condition worsened. His assistant had tried to reach distant relatives, but Richard had always been a man who kept to himself, building walls around his heart as methodically as he had built his business empire. The irony wasn't lost on the medical staff that one of Denver's wealthiest men lay dying alone, while a little girl with nothing to her name was literally giving her life force to save him. Dr. Thompson, the head of hematology, had never seen anything quite like it in his 30 years of practice. "It's remarkable," he told his colleague as they prepared to administer Madison's blood to Richard. "The girl's blood type is so rare, and it's exactly what he needs. The odds of finding a compatible donor were astronomical." As the precious blood entered Richard's system, something extraordinary began to happen. The monitors that had shown dangerously low readings for weeks began to stabilize. His blood pressure improved, his breathing became less labored, and for the first time since his collapse, there was real hope. In the pediatric ward, Madison was recovering from her donation with apple juice and cookies, her cheeks still flushed from the procedure, but her spirits high. She had been allowed to stay overnight for observation, and she found herself strangely excited about the possibility that she had helped save someone's life. "Did I really help him?" she asked Dr. Morris as the woman tucked her into the hospital bed. "You did something wonderful, Madison. Something that very few people could do. You should be very proud of yourself." As Madison drifted off to sleep, she dreamed of the man she had helped. In her dream, he had kind eyes and a gentle smile, and he thanked her for her bravery. She didn't know that 3 floors above, Richard Sterling was beginning to stir from his coma, his first conscious thought being an unexplainable feeling that someone had reached out to pull him back from the edge of darkness. The night shift nurses noted the improvement in both patients' conditions with amazement. Little did they know that this was just the beginning of a story that would change both of their lives in ways neither could imagine. Mrs. Henderson sat in the uncomfortable plastic chair beside Madison's bed, filing papers and calculating costs. To her, the girl was simply another ward of the state, another responsibility to manage. She couldn't have foreseen that by morning everything would be different, and that the little girl's act of pure generosity would set in motion events that would challenge everything she thought she knew about power, love, and family. The morning sun streamed through the hospital windows as Richard Sterling's eyes fluttered open for the first time in 17 days. The world came into focus, slowly. White ceiling tiles, the rhythmic beeping of monitors, the antiseptic smell that could only mean one thing. He was in a hospital, and from the feeling in his body, he had been there for quite some time. "Mr. Sterling?" A nurse appeared beside his bed almost instantly, her face brightening with surprise and relief. "You're awake! How are you feeling?" Richard tried to speak, but his throat felt like sandpaper. The nurse quickly offered him ice chips, and after a few moments he managed to croak out, "What happened?" "You've been in a coma for over 2 weeks, sir. You collapsed in your office from a rare blood disorder. But you're going to be okay now, thanks to a very special little girl." Richard's brow furrowed in confusion. "Little girl?" Before the nurse could explain further, Dr. Thompson entered the room, his face showing the satisfaction of a man who had just witnessed what could only be described as a medical miracle. "Welcome back to the land of the living, Mr. Sterling," Dr. Thompson said with a warm smile. "You gave us quite a scare." Your condition was critical, and we weren't sure you were going to make it. But yesterday, we found a compatible blood donor, and the transfusion seems to have turned things around completely." "A donor?" Richard asked, his voice growing stronger with each word. "A 7-year-old girl named Madison Carter. She has the same extremely rare blood type as you, AB negative, with a specific Rh factor that occurs in less than 1% of the population. Without her donation, I'm afraid the outcome would have been very different." Richard Sterling, a man accustomed to being in control of every situation, felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was hearing. A child, a stranger, had literally saved his life. The concept was both humbling and deeply moving. "Where is she now?" he asked. "Still here in the pediatric ward, recovering from the donation. She's from Sunset Hills Children's Home. Remarkable little girl, showed more courage than most adults would have in her situation." An orphan. The word hit Richard like a physical blow. This brave little girl who had saved his life had no parents, no family to comfort her after her selfless act. Something stirred in Richard's chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. Protective instinct. "I want to meet her," Richard said firmly. Dr. Thompson hesitated. "Mr. Sterling, you're still recovering, and there are protocols." "Doctor, a child saved my life. The least I can do is thank her properly." Richard's voice carried the authority of a man who was used to getting his way, but underneath it was genuine gratitude, and something else, curiosity about this little angel who had reached out to help a complete stranger. 2 hours later, after Richard had been moved to a regular room and had regained more of his strength, Dr. Morris escorted him to the pediatric ward. His legs were unsteady, but his determination was unwavering. Madison was sitting by the window in her room, coloring in a book that looked well used and worn. Her golden hair caught the morning light, and when she looked up at the sound of footsteps, Richard saw the most extraordinary blue eyes he had ever encountered. Eyes that seemed far too wise for someone so young, yet still held the innocence that made his heart ache. "Madison," Dr. Morris said gently, "I'd like you to meet someone very special. This is Mr. Sterling, the man you helped yesterday." Madison set down her crayon and looked up at Richard with genuine interest. At 7 years old, she had no concept of wealth or social status. To her, he was simply the sick man she had tried to help. "Are you feeling better?" she asked with the direct honesty that only children possess. Richard found himself momentarily speechless. This tiny girl, who had every reason to be bitter about her circumstances, was looking at him with pure concern and kindness. He lowered himself carefully into the chair beside her bed, bringing himself closer to her eye level. "Yes, I'm feeling much better, and it's all because of you," he said softly. "You saved my life, Madison. Do you understand how brave you were?" Madison shrugged, a gesture that somehow managed to be both modest and matter-of-fact. "My mommy always said we should help people when they need help. You needed help." "Tell me about your mommy," Richard said, surprising himself with the request. He never asked personal questions, never got involved in people's emotional lives, but something about this child made him want to know everything. Madison's face lit up with the joy that comes from talking about someone deeply loved. She was really pretty, and she made the best pancakes in the whole world. "She and Daddy died in a car accident when I was 4, but before they went to heaven, they taught me lots of important things." Richard felt his chest tighten with emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in decades. His own childhood had been cold and distant, raised by nannies and boarding schools, while his parents focused on their social obligations. This little girl, who had lost everything, spoke of her parents with such love and carried their lessons in her heart. "What else did they teach you?" he asked. "To be kind to everyone, even if they're mean to you. To share what you have, even if it's not very much. And to never give up hope, because good things can happen when you least expect them." As Richard listened to Madison's wisdom, delivered with the simple clarity of a child's understanding, he realized that this 7-year-old had more emotional intelligence and strength of character than most of the adults he dealt with in the business world. Mrs. Henderson chose that moment to enter the room, her expression shifting from surprise to calculation when she saw Richard. Even in his hospital gown, there was something about his bearing, his expensive watch, and the deference of the medical staff that suggested wealth and influence. "Mr. Sterling, I presume? I'm Mrs. Henderson, director of Sunset Hills Children's Home. Madison is one of our children." Richard stood politely, but his attention remained focused on Madison. "Mrs. Henderson, Madison has just done something extraordinary, and I want to make sure she's properly recognized for her bravery." "Of course, any recognition would go through the proper channels at the home," Mrs. Henderson replied, her tone suggesting she expected to control any interaction between Richard and Madison. Something about the woman's possessive attitude rubbed Richard the wrong way. He had built his fortune on reading people, and Mrs. Henderson struck him as someone who saw Madison as property rather than a child in need of love and care. "Madison," Richard said, turning back to the little girl, "I want you to know that if you ever need anything at all, you can call me. Would you like that?" Madison nodded enthusiastically, but Mrs. Henderson quickly interjected. "Mr. Sterling, I'm sure you mean well, but the children at our facility follow strict schedules and guidelines. Outside contact needs to be approved through the proper procedures." Richard's business instincts, honed by years of negotiations, immediately sensed that something was wrong with this picture. His protective feelings toward Madison intensified, and he made a mental note to learn more about Sunset Hills Children's Home and the woman who ran it. As visiting hours ended and Mrs. Henderson hurried Madison away, the little girl turned back to Richard with a smile that seemed to light up the entire hallway. "I hope you get all the way better, Mr. Sterling," she called out. "Thank you, Madison, for everything." As he watched her disappear around the corner, Richard Sterling made a decision that would change both of their lives forever. This remarkable little girl, who had saved his life with such selfless courage, deserved better than the cold institutional care he sensed she was receiving. He reached for his phone and called his personal assistant, his voice strong and determined for the first time since waking up. "Sarah, I need you to do some research for me. I want to know everything there is to know about Sunset Hills Children's Home and a 7-year-old girl named Madison Carter. And Sarah, this is priority 1. Everything else can wait." 3 weeks after his discharge from Denver General Hospital, Richard Sterling sat in his downtown office, but his mind wasn't on quarterly reports or board meetings. Spread across his mahogany desk were detailed files about Sunset Hills Children's Home, Madison Carter, and the disturbing discoveries his private investigator had uncovered. Sarah Mitchell, his longtime personal assistant, sat across from him with a grave expression. At 45, Sarah had worked for Richard for over a decade and had never seen him so emotionally invested in anything outside of business. "The financial records don't add up, Mr. Sterling," Sarah reported, her voice tight with controlled anger. "Sunset Hills receives substantial state funding for each child, plus private donations, but the living conditions are barely adequate. The children sleep 4 to a room, meals are minimal, and educational resources are almost non-existent." Richard's jaw clenched as he reviewed photographs of the facility. The building was run down, with peeling paint and broken playground equipment. This was where Madison, the brave little girl who had saved his life, was expected to call home. "Where's the money going?" Richard asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Mrs. Henderson's personal accounts show significant deposits that don't correspond to her official salary. She's also made several expensive purchases recently: a new car, renovations to her personal home, a vacation to Europe. Richard felt a familiar surge of the anger that had driven him to build his business empire, but this time it wasn't about corporate competition. This was about protecting someone who had shown him more genuine kindness than he had experienced in years. "What about Madison specifically?" Sarah's expression softened. "She's remarkable, Mr. Sterling. Her teachers at the local elementary school rave about her intelligence and compassion. She helps other children with their homework, shares her lunch with kids who don't have enough, and according to her teacher, Mrs. Patterson, she's reading at a 5th grade level despite being only 7. Richard wasn't surprised. Even in their brief hospital encounter, he had sensed something extraordinary about Madison, an inner strength and wisdom that seemed to radiate from her small frame. "There's something else," Sarah continued, hesitating slightly. "Madison asks about you, Mrs. Patterson mentioned that she talks about the man she helped and wonders if you're feeling better. She even wrote you a get-well card, but Mrs. Henderson wouldn't let her send it." Richard's heart twisted at the image of Madison, despite her own difficult circumstances, worrying about his well-being. It reinforced his growing determination to change her situation. "I want to visit her," Richard announced, standing up from his desk with renewed energy. "Mr. Sterling, Mrs. Henderson has made it clear that unscheduled visits aren't welcome. She's established very strict policies about outside contact with the children." "Then I'll schedule a visit. Better yet, I'll schedule a donation tour. Potential benefactors get the red carpet treatment, don't they?" Sarah smiled for the first time during their meeting. "You're thinking of making a donation?" "I'm thinking of making a very substantial donation, one that comes with conditions." The following afternoon, Richard arrived at Sunset Hills Children's Home in his Tesla Model S, dressed in his finest business suit. Mrs. Henderson greeted him at the entrance with an obsequious smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mr. Sterling, what an honor to have you visit our humble facility. I understand you're interested in supporting our mission?" "Very interested," Richard replied, his tone professionally neutral, despite his personal feelings about the woman. "I believe children are our most precious resource, and every child deserves the best possible start in life." Mrs. Henderson led him through the building, keeping up a constant stream of carefully rehearsed talking points about their programs and services. Richard observed everything with a critical eye, noting the stark contrast between the public areas, which were clean but minimal, and glimpses of the living quarters, which appeared overcrowded and inadequately maintained. "And this is our common room, where the children spend their recreational time," Mrs. Henderson announced, opening a door to reveal a space with mismatched furniture and a single television with poor reception. Richard was about to respond when he heard a voice that made his heart skip. "Mr. Sterling?" He turned to see Madison standing in the doorway, her face lighting up with genuine joy. She was wearing the same worn clothes he remembered from the hospital, but her smile was radiant. "Madison," Richard said warmly, crouching down to her level, "how are you feeling? Did you recover well from helping me?" "I'm fine," Madison replied, but Richard noticed she looked thinner than he remembered, and there were dark circles under her bright blue eyes. "Are you all better now?" "Thanks to you, I'm completely healthy," Richard assured her. "I've been hoping to see you again to thank you properly." Mrs. Henderson quickly stepped forward. "Madison, you should be in study hall with the other children. Mr. Sterling is here on important business." "Actually," Richard interjected smoothly, "I'd love to hear from Madison about her experience here. After all, the children's perspectives are the most important part of evaluating any program." Mrs. Henderson's smile became strained, but she couldn't object without seeming unreasonable in front of a potential major donor. Madison looked between the adults uncertainly, clearly sensing the tension but not understanding its source. Her innate kindness made her want to please everyone, a trait that Richard found both endearing and heartbreaking. "Tell me about your day, Madison," Richard encouraged. "What do you like to do here?" "I like to read," Madison replied thoughtfully. "Mrs. Patterson at school lets me borrow books, and I share them with the other kids. We don't have very many books here, but I try to remember the stories so I can tell them to the little ones before bedtime." Richard felt another surge of protectiveness. This 7-year-old was taking care of other children, sharing knowledge and comfort despite having so little herself. "What about meals?" Richard asked casually. "I hope you're getting plenty of good food to keep up your strength after your generous donation." Madison's hesitation was brief but telling. "We get breakfast, lunch and dinner," she answered diplomatically, clearly having been taught not to complain. Mrs. Henderson jumped in quickly. "Our nutritionist ensures all meals meet state requirements for balanced nutrition." Richard made a mental note to investigate the meal programs, suspecting that meeting state requirements was a far cry from providing adequate nutrition for growing children. As the tour continued, Richard found opportunities to speak with several other children, asking casual questions about their daily routines, their schooling, and their general well-being. A pattern quickly emerged. The children were polite and well-behaved, but there was a guarded quality to their responses that suggested they had learned to be cautious about expressing dissatisfaction. When the tour concluded, Richard found himself alone with Mrs. Henderson in her office, surrounded by certificates and awards that seemed designed to impress visitors rather than reflect genuine achievement. "As you can see, Mr. Sterling, we're providing excellent care for these children despite our limited resources," Mrs. Henderson began, clearly preparing to make her pitch for funding. "I'm certainly impressed by the children," Richard replied carefully. "They seem remarkably resilient and well-behaved. Madison, in particular, is an extraordinary little girl." Mrs. Henderson's expression sharpened slightly. "Madison is indeed special, quite intelligent, though sometimes she can be a bit too independent for her own good. Children in her situation need structure and discipline to prepare them for realistic futures." Richard's business instincts detected something troubling in her tone. "What do you mean by her situation?" "Well, she's been here for 3 years now, and at 7 years old, her chances for adoption are becoming quite slim. Older children, especially those without perfect medical histories, tend to remain in the system. It's better for her to accept that reality and focus on practical skills rather than developing unrealistic expectations." Richard felt a flash of anger at the woman's casual dismissal of Madison's potential. Unrealistic expectations. Academic excellence, for instance. Madison is bright, but it's important not to fill these children's heads with impossible dreams. Most of them will enter the workforce directly after aging out of the system. Better to prepare them for service positions than to encourage aspirations they'll never be able to achieve. Every word misses. Henderson spoke reinforced Richard's determination to change Madison's circumstances. This woman was not only neglecting the physical needs of the children in her care, but actively limiting their emotional and intellectual development. "I'd like to make a donation," Richard announced, his decision crystallizing in that moment. Mrs. Henderson's eyes lit up with avarice. "How generous! What amount were you considering?" $100,000, Richard said, watching her face carefully. "With conditions." The woman tried to hide her shock at the amount, but Richard caught the brief flash of greed in her eyes. "Conditions? I want regular reports on how the money is being used. I want to see improvements in living conditions, educational resources, and nutrition programs. And I want to be able to visit periodically to assess the progress." Mrs. Henderson's expression became calculating. "Of course, we would be happy to accommodate a donor of your generosity. Though I should mention that unexpected visits can be disruptive to the children's routines." "I'm sure we can work out a suitable arrangement," Richard replied smoothly. "I'll have my attorney draft the donation agreement with the specific terms." As Richard left Sunset Hills Children's Home that afternoon, his mind was already racing with plans. The donation would provide him with legitimate access to check on Madison's well-being, but it was only the first step in a larger strategy that was still forming in his mind. Driving back to his office, he couldn't stop thinking about Madison's bright intelligence being dimmed by an administrator who saw her as nothing more than a source of funding. The little girl who had saved his life with such courage and generosity deserved every opportunity to grow and thrive, and Richard Sterling was determined to make sure she got them. That evening, he made 2 phone calls that would change everything. The first was to his attorney Victoria Hartwell, one of Denver's most respected family law practitioners. The second was to a private investigator who specialized in child welfare cases. By the time Richard went to bed that night, the wheels were in motion for what would become the most important battle of his life, not for a corporate merger or a business acquisition, but for the future of a 7-year-old girl who had already given him more than he had ever imagined possible. Victoria Hartwell's law office on 17th Street commanded an impressive view of downtown Denver, but Richard Sterling barely noticed the cityscape as he sat across from the woman who would become his most trusted ally in the fight ahead. At 34, Victoria possessed the rare combination of brilliant legal mind and genuine compassion that made her one of the most sought-after family law attorneys in Colorado. "Mr. Sterling," Victoria began, her green eyes sharp with professional focus as she reviewed the documents Richard had provided. "What you're describing about Sunset Hills is deeply troubling, but pursuing custody of Madison will not be a simple process. The state has very specific procedures for adoption, and Mrs. Henderson will likely fight any attempt to remove a child who represents significant ongoing revenue for her facility." Richard studied Victoria's face as she spoke, noting the passion that crept into her voice when she discussed child welfare. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a professional bun, but a few rebellious strands framed her face, softening features that spoke of strength and determination. She was beautiful, but it was her obvious intelligence and fierce protective instincts that drew Richard's attention. "What are our options?" Richard asked, leaning forward in his chair. "Several paths, each with different challenges," Victoria replied, opening a legal pad and beginning to outline strategies. "First, we could pursue a standard adoption through proper channels, but that could take months or even years, and there's no guarantee of success. Mrs. Henderson has legal guardianship rights as the facility director." What's the second option?" Victoria's expression grew more serious. "If we can prove neglect or abuse, Child Protective Services could remove Madison from Sunset Hills immediately. But that would place her in temporary foster care, not with you, and the burden of proof is substantial." Richard felt frustration building in his chest. Every day that Madison remained in that inadequate environment was another day of her childhood being wasted, another day of her extraordinary potential being diminished by an administrator who saw her as nothing more than a funding source. "There is a third possibility," Victoria continued, her voice dropping slightly as if she were sharing a secret. "If we could establish that you have some legal standing beyond being a grateful patient, perhaps a family connection or special relationship that predates the blood donation, the court might fast-track the proceedings." Family connection?" Richard asked, confusion evident in his voice. "I'd never met Madison before that day in the hospital." Victoria studied his face carefully, her legal instincts detecting something in his expression that even Richard himself might not have recognized. Sometimes, families are separated by circumstances beyond their control. Children placed for adoption, relatives who lose touch, paperwork that gets lost in bureaucratic systems. Have you ever looked into your extended family history? Richard had built his fortune on facts, figures, and logical analysis, but Victoria's suggestion stirred something deep in his subconscious, a nagging sense that his connection to Madison went beyond gratitude for her life-saving donation. "My parents died when I was 22, Richard said slowly. They weren't particularly family-oriented people. I was raised primarily by nannies and boarding schools. If I have extended family, I've never known about them." "What about siblings, cousins?" "Sometimes family connections exist that we're not aware of, especially in cases where children were placed for adoption or families were separated by tragedy." Victoria's words planted a seed of possibility that Richard found both intriguing and unsettling. His parents had been wealthy but distant, focused more on their social obligations than on building family connections. It was entirely possible that family relationships existed that had never been acknowledged or discussed. "How would we investigate something like that?" Richard asked. "Genealogical research, family records, DNA testing if necessary. It's a long shot, but if there's even a remote possibility of a family connection, it could change everything about our legal strategy." BD, as they discussed the practical aspects of investigating Richard's family history, he found himself drawn to Victoria's passion for protecting children. When she spoke about family law, her entire demeanor changed, becoming more animated, more emotionally engaged than her professional persona usually allowed. "Why family law?" Richard asked during a brief pause in their strategic planning. Victoria's expression softened, and for a moment the competent attorney was replaced by someone more vulnerable. "I was adopted when I was 8, she said quietly. "My birth parents died in an accident, and I spent 2 years in foster care before the Hartwells found me. They were incredible people who gave me love, stability, and opportunities I never could have imagined." Richard felt a jolt of recognition. Victoria's story paralleled Madison's in significant ways, which explained the fierce protectiveness he had observed when she discussed child welfare cases. "I know what it feels like to be alone and uncertain about your future," Victoria continued. "I also know how transformative it can be when the right family comes along at the right time. Every child deserves that chance." Their conversation was interrupted by Richard's phone, buzzing with a text message from his private investigator. "Found something significant about Madison's background. Need to meet ASAP." "I need to step out for a moment," Richard told Victoria, but she was already gathering her files. "Actually, I should head over to Sunset Hills to begin some preliminary observations. If we're going to build a case, I need to document the conditions there myself." As Victoria prepared to leave, Richard found himself reluctant to see her go. Their professional relationship was developing into something more personal, and he realized that Victoria's combination of strength, intelligence, and compassion was exactly what he had been missing in his carefully controlled life. "Victoria," he said as she reached the door, "would you be interested in having dinner tonight?" "To discuss strategy," he added quickly, not wanting to appear unprofessional. Victoria's smile was warm and genuine. "I'd like that, Richard. Strategy is definitely something we should discuss." 2 hours later, Richard met with Jake Morrison, the private investigator he had hired to dig deeper into Madison's background. Jake was a former police detective whose expertise in missing persons cases had made him invaluable in family law matters. "You're going to want to sit down for this, Mr. Sterling," Jake said, spreading photographs and documents across the conference room table. "Madison Carter's story is more complicated than it appears on the surface." Richard studied the documents, his business-trained mind quickly absorbing the information. Birth certificate, hospital records, death certificates for her parents. Everything seemed straightforward at first glance. "What am I missing?" Richard asked. "Look at the birth certificate more carefully," Jake instructed. "Specifically the parents' names and birthplaces." Richard examined the document again. Michael Carter, born in Boston. Sarah Carter, née. Richard's voice trailed off as he read the maiden name. Sarah Sterling Carter. Sterling, Jake confirmed. Same last name as yours, and the birthplace matches records for a Sarah Sterling who would have been the right age to be Madison's mother. Richard felt the room spinning slightly as the implications hit him. Are you suggesting that Madison's mother might have been related to me? It gets more interesting, Jake continued, producing another set of documents. I pulled your father's family records. He had a younger brother named David Sterling who moved to Boston in the 1980s. David had a daughter named Sarah who was born in 1989. Richard's hands trembled slightly as he processed the information. Sarah would have been the right age to be Madison's mother. There's more, Jake said gently, clearly aware of the emotional impact his findings were having. David Sterling died in a car accident in 1995. When Sarah was only 6 years old, she was placed in foster care because your parents never acknowledged the relationship or claimed custody. The revelation hit Richard like a physical blow. While he was growing up in privilege and wealth, his cousin Sarah had been alone in the foster care system, just like Madison was now. The parallels were too significant to be coincidental. So Madison could be, Richard began. Your second cousin, Jake finished. Your father's brother's granddaughter, family. Richard sat in stunned silence, absorbing the magnitude of what he had just learned. Madison wasn't just the brave little girl who had saved his life. She was family. She was blood. And she was living in inadequate conditions while he had the resources to give her everything she deserved. How certain are you about this connection? Richard asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Birth records, death certificates, and family documentation are all consistent, Jake replied. But the only way to be absolutely certain would be DNA testing. Richard's phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. Victoria's voice was tense and urgent. Richard, you need to get to Sunset Hills immediately. I've been observing the facility, and something's happening. Mrs. Henderson is meeting with what appears to be prospective adoptive parents, and they're specifically interested in Madison. I think she's trying to place her before you can intervene. The news galvanized Richard into immediate action. The possibility that Madison was his family member gave him legal standing to challenge any adoption proceedings, but only if he could prove the relationship quickly enough. Jake, I need that DNA test arranged immediately, Richard said, already heading for the door. And I need it expedited through whatever channels necessary. Already on it, Jake replied. I have contacts at the lab who can process it in 24 hours instead of the usual week. As Richard drove towards Sunset Hills, his mind raced with the implications of Jake's discovery. If Madison was truly his cousin, it would change everything about their relationship and his legal rights. More importantly, it would mean that the brave little girl who had saved his life was also the family member he had never known he was missing. The irony wasn't lost on him that Madison, who had given him back his physical life, might also be the key to the emotional life he had never allowed himself to have. As he pulled into the parking lot of Sunset Hills Children's Home, Richard Sterling was no longer just a grateful patient or a wealthy philanthropist. He was a man fighting for his family. The scene at Sunset Hills Children's Home was more tense than Richard had anticipated. Victoria's car was parked near the entrance, and through the main window he could see her engaged in what appeared to be a heated discussion with Mrs. Henderson and two other adults, a middle-aged couple dressed in expensive clothing who had the unmistakable look of wealthy potential adopters. Richard entered the building just as voices were being raised in the main office. Mrs. Henderson, I must insist that any adoption proceedings involving Madison Carter be postponed until my client's legal interests can be properly evaluated, Victoria was saying. her professional composure intact despite the obvious tension in her voice. "Your client has no legal standing regarding any of our children," Mrs. Henderson replied sharply. "Mr. and Mrs. Blackwood are qualified adoptive parents who have been approved through all proper channels." Richard stepped into the office, his presence immediately shifting the dynamics of the conversation. Mrs. Henderson's expression hardened, while Victoria looked relieved at his arrival. "Mr. Sterling, Mrs. Henderson said with false courtesy. "What a surprise to see you here again so soon. I'm afraid this isn't a good time for a social visit. We're in the middle of important proceedings." "Actually," Richard said calmly, "this is exactly the right time for me to be here. I've just learned some information that directly affects Madison's situation." Mr. Blackwood, a man in his 50s with silver hair and an air of entitlement, looked annoyed by the interruption. "I don't understand why there's any delay. We've been approved for adoption. We've selected Madison specifically, and we're prepared to take her home today." Something about the man's tone, the way he spoke about selecting Madison as if she were a commodity, made Richard's protective instincts flare dangerously. "On what basis are you claiming any legal interest in this child?" Mrs. Blackwood asked, her voice carrying the sharp edge of someone accustomed to getting her way through intimidation. Victoria stepped forward smoothly. "Mr. Sterling has reason to believe he may be related to Madison Carter, which would give him preferential standing in any adoption proceedings." The room fell silent. Mrs. Henderson's face went pale, clearly recognizing the threat this revelation posed to her financial arrangements with the Blackwoods. "Related how?" Mrs. Henderson demanded. Richard pulled out the documents Jake had given him earlier. Madison's mother was Sarah Sterling Carter. According to family records, Sarah Sterling was my first cousin, the daughter of my father's younger brother, David. "That's impossible, Mrs. Henderson said quickly, but Richard could hear the uncertainty in her voice. "Madison has no family. That's why she's been in our care for 3 years. Family connections can be lost in bureaucratic systems," Victoria explained professionally. "Children are often placed in care when immediate family members aren't located or contacted. It happens more often than people realize." Mr. Blackwood's face was growing red with frustration. "This is absurd. We've been through months of paperwork and background checks. You can't just waltz in here and claim some distant family connection." "Actually," Richard said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had dominated boardrooms for years, "I can. And I intend to pursue every legal avenue available to ensure Madison's welfare is properly protected." Mrs. Henderson's calculating mind was clearly working through the implications. A contested adoption would bring scrutiny she couldn't afford, especially with a wealthy opponent who had the resources to investigate her operations thoroughly. "Where is Madison now?" Victoria asked. "She's in the common room with the other children," Mrs. Henderson replied reluctantly. "I'd like to speak with her," Richard said. "Absolutely not," Mr. Blackwood interjected. "We have legal paperwork in progress. No one else should be confusing the child with alternative scenarios." Victoria's legal training kicked in immediately. "Mr. Sterling has the right to verify his family relationship before any adoption proceeds. In fact, given the potential family connection, state law requires that possibility be thoroughly investigated." As the adults argued, none of them noticed Madison herself appearing in the doorway of the office. At 7 years old, she possessed an intuitive understanding of adult emotions that allowed her to sense conflict even when she couldn't understand its source. "Mr. Sterling?" Madison's small voice cut through the heated discussion, immediately drawing everyone's attention. "Why is everyone upset?" Richard's heart melted at the sight of her concerned face. In her worn clothes and with her golden hair slightly tangled, she looked so small and vulnerable, yet her blue eyes held the same wisdom and strength he had admired from their first meeting. "Hello, Madison," Richard said gently, crouching down to her eye level as he had done during their previous encounters. "How are you feeling today?" "I'm okay," Madison replied, but her eyes darted nervously between the adults. "Mrs. Henderson said some people want to take me to live with them. Are they nice people?" The innocence of her question hit everyone in the room like a physical blow. Here was a 7-year-old girl whose entire life had been disrupted by circumstances beyond her control, trying to understand whether the next change in her life would be positive or negative. Richard felt a surge of emotion so powerful it nearly took his breath away. Looking at Madison's trusting face, he realized that his feelings went far beyond gratitude for her life-saving donation, far beyond newfound family connections. This little girl had become the most important person in his world, and the thought of her being taken away by strangers who saw her as a commodity rather than a precious individual was unbearable. "Madison," Richard said softly, "how would you feel about coming to live with me instead?" The room erupted in objections from Mrs. Henderson and the Blackwoods, but Richard kept his eyes focused on Madison, waiting for her response. Madison studied his face with the serious consideration that seemed to characterize all her decisions. "Would I still be able to go to school with Mrs. Patterson? And could I bring my book about butterflies that she gave me?" "Of course," Richard replied, his voice thick with emotion. "You could do anything you wanted to do." "What about the other kids here? Who would read them stories at bedtime if I'm not here?" Even in considering her own future, Madison's first concern was for the well-being of others. Richard realized that this 7-year-old had more natural empathy and leadership ability than most adults he knew. "We could arrange for other people to help with that," Richard assured her. "Maybe we could even find ways to help all the children here have better lives." Madison nodded slowly, then surprised everyone by walking over to Richard and taking his hand in her small one. "I would like to live with you," she said simply. "You feel safe." The gesture and her words created a moment of profound silence in the room. Even the Blackwoods seemed affected by the obvious bond between Richard and Madison. Mrs. Henderson was the first to break the spell. "This is highly irregular. Adoption procedures exist for good reasons, and they can't be circumvented based on emotional appeals." "You're absolutely right," Victoria agreed smoothly. "Which is why we're going to follow procedures exactly, Mr. Sterling will submit DNA evidence proving his family relationship to Madison, along with a formal petition for custody based on kinship priority. In the meantime, no other adoption proceedings should move forward." "How long will this take?" Mrs. Henderson asked, clearly frustrated by the disruption to her plans. "The DNA results will be available tomorrow," Richard replied. "After that, we can pursue the legal process as quickly as the courts will allow." Mr. Blackwood made one final attempt to salvage their adoption plans. "We've invested significant time and resources in this process. Surely there must be some consideration for prior claims." Victoria's expression remained professionally neutral, but her voice carried an edge of steel. "Prior claims are superseded by family relationships. If Mr. Sterling can prove Madison is his relative, his legal standing takes precedence over other prospective adoptive parents." As the meeting broke up, Richard realized that the next 24 hours would determine Madison's future and his own. The DNA test would either confirm the family connection that would allow him to provide Madison with the loving home she deserved, or reveal that his hopes were based on mistaken assumptions. That evening, Richard and Victoria had dinner at an upscale restaurant downtown, but neither of them was particularly focused on the food. The day's events had intensified their partnership into something that felt increasingly personal. "What if the DNA test doesn't confirm the family connection?" Victoria asked over untouched plates of salmon. Richard considered the question seriously. "Then I'll pursue standard adoption procedures and fight for Madison through every legal channel available." "That could take years, And there's no guarantee of success. Then I'll take years, Richard replied with quiet determination. Madison saved my life, Victoria. Not just medically, but in ways I'm only beginning to understand. She's shown me what it means to have someone to care about beyond myself, someone worth fighting for. Victoria studied his face in the candlelight, recognizing the transformation she had witnessed over the past few weeks. The successful but emotionally distant CEO she had first met was becoming someone capable of deep love and protective commitment. "What about us?" Victoria asked softly. "This case has brought us together, but what happens when it's resolved?" Richard reached across the table and took her hand, his touch gentle but certain. "I hope it's just the beginning. I've spent years building a successful business, but I've never built a life worth living. You and Madison are changing that." As they drove home that night, neither Richard nor Victoria could have imagined that the DNA results would reveal not just the family connection they hoped for, but a secret that would explain the extraordinary bond Richard had felt with Madison from the moment they first met. The truth would change everything they thought they knew about fate, family, and the mysterious ways that love finds its way into even the most carefully guarded hearts. The call came at 7:30 in the morning. Richard was already awake, having spent most of the night alternating between nervous energy and cautious optimism about the DNA results. Jake Morrison's voice was carefully controlled, but Richard detected an undercurrent of excitement that made his heart race. "Mr. Sterling, you need to come to my office immediately. The results are back, and there's something you need to see in person." Richard dressed quickly and drove through downtown Denver with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety that he had never experienced in any business deal. Victoria was already at Jake's office when he arrived, her professional composure intact, but her eyes bright with curiosity. "The DNA results confirm a family relationship," Jake announced without preamble, "but it's not what we expected." Richard felt his heart skip. "What do you mean?" Jake spread the laboratory reports across his desk, pointing to specific sections highlighted in yellow. "The genetic markers don't indicate a second-cousin relationship through your father's brother. They indicate a much closer connection." "How much closer?" Victoria asked, her legal training making her focus on the precise implications. "Uncle and niece," Jake replied. "Madison Carter is not your second cousin, Mr. Sterling. She's your niece. Your direct niece." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Richard stared at the scientific data that was rewriting his understanding of his own family history. "That's impossible," Richard said slowly. "I don't have any siblings. My parents never had other children." Jake pulled out another set of documents, his expression grave. "Your father did have another child, Mr. Sterling, a daughter born in 1987, 2 years after you. Her name was Sarah Sterling, and she was Madison's mother." Richard felt the foundation of everything he thought he knew about his family shifting beneath him. "My father had a daughter, my sister." "Your half-sister," Jake clarified. "Born to a woman named Margaret Collins, who worked as a housekeeper for your family. When Margaret became pregnant, your parents paid for her to relocate to Boston and raise the child away from Denver society. They provided financial support, but insisted the relationship remain completely secret." Victoria was taking notes rapidly, her legal mind processing the implications. So Madison's mother was Richard's half-sister, making Madison his niece, not his second cousin. "Exactly. And there's more," Jake continued. "When Sarah died in the car accident with her husband Michael, your parents were contacted about Madison. They chose not to acknowledge the relationship or claim custody. Madison was placed in state care because her only known relative refused to take responsibility for her." Richard felt a wave of anger and grief unlike anything he had ever experienced. His parents, who had raised him with cold efficiency but adequate resources, had allowed their granddaughter to enter the foster care system rather than acknowledge a family scandal from decades ago. "They knew," Richard said, his voice barely above a whisper. "When Madison was placed in care 3 years ago, they knew she was family, and they did nothing. The records indicate they were contacted by Child Protective Services and declined involvement," Jake confirmed. "Madison has been alone for 3 years, while her grandfather and uncle were living in the same city." Victoria reached over and took Richard's hand, offering silent support as he processed the devastating revelation. The successful, controlled life he had built for himself suddenly felt like a betrayal of the family member he had never known existed. "There's something else," Jake said gently. "Something that makes this story even more remarkable." Richard looked up, wondering what additional revelations could possibly compare to learning he had a niece he had never known about. "The rare blood type that saved your life, the AB negative with the specific RH factor, it runs in families. Madison was able to save you not just because she was brave enough to donate, but because she shared your genetic makeup. She saved you because you're family." The poetic justice of the situation was almost overwhelming. Madison, abandoned by family members who should have protected her, had unknowingly saved the life of the uncle who could give her the love and security she deserved. The connection Richard had felt from the moment he met her wasn't just gratitude or admiration, it was the recognition of family, operating on a level deeper than conscious awareness. "What happens now?" Richard asked, his voice steadying with new resolve. Victoria was already organizing documents. "Now we have irrefutable legal standing. As Madison's uncle and closest living relative, you have priority rights over any other adoption proceedings. Mrs. Henderson and the Blackwoods have no legal basis to contest your custody claim." "How quickly can we make this official?" "With DNA evidence this clear and family priority rights, we can have emergency custody transferred within hours," Victoria replied. "Judge Martinez handles emergency family cases, and she'll prioritize a situation where a child's immediate family has been located." 3 hours later, Richard found himself back at Sunset Hills Children's Home, but this time he carried legal documents that would change Madison's life forever. Victoria accompanied him, along with a social worker from Child Protective Services who would facilitate the official transfer of custody. Mrs. Henderson met them at the entrance, her expression a mixture of frustration and resignation. The financial loss of losing Madison, combined with the potential scrutiny Richard's custody case might bring to her operations, had clearly shaken her composure. "The paperwork appears to be in order," Mrs. Henderson said stiffly, reviewing the court documents. "Madison is in the common room. I'll send someone to get her." "I'd like to tell her myself," Richard said. "This is going to be a big change for her, and I want to make sure she understands what's happening." Madison was sitting by the window in the common room, reading to 2 younger children from her treasured butterfly book. The sight of her naturally taking care of others, even in her own moment of uncertainty, reinforced Richard's certainty that she belonged with family who would nurture and support her generous spirit. "Madison," Richard called softly. She looked up, her face brightening when she saw him. "Mr. Sterling, did you come to visit?" "Actually, I came to take you home," Richard said, sitting down beside her on the worn couch. "Remember how you asked if you would like to come live with me?" Madison nodded, her blue eyes wide with attention. "Well, I found out something wonderful. We're family, Madison. Your mother was my sister, which makes you my niece." Madison processed this information with the serious consideration she brought to all important matters. "So, you're my uncle?" "Yes, I am. And I would very much like you to come live with me, not just because you saved my life, but because you're family, and families should take care of each other." Madison's response was immediate and wholehearted. She threw her small arms around Richard's neck in a hug that conveyed all the love and trust her 7-year-old heart could hold. "I want to come home with you, Uncle Richard," she whispered against his shoulder. As Richard held his niece for the first time, feeling her small body relax against him, with complete faith in his promise to care for her, he realized that this moment represented the completion of a circle that had begun the day she donated her blood to save his life. The practical arrangements of transitioning Madison from institutional care to her new life took several hours, but by evening she was standing in the entrance hall of Richard's downtown penthouse, clutching her butterfly book and looking around with wonder at what would now be her home. "This is where you live?" Madison asked, her voice filled with amazement as she took in the sweeping views of Denver and the elegant furnishings. "This is where we live," Richard corrected gently. "Would you like to see your room?" Victoria had spent the afternoon working with an interior designer to transform Richard's guest room into a space suitable for a 7-year-old girl. The result was magical. Walls painted in soft pastels, furniture sized for a child, shelves ready to hold books, and a window seat overlooking the city where Madison could read and dream. Madison walked around the room slowly, touching each piece of furniture as if to confirm it was real. When she reached the bookshelf, already stocked with age-appropriate literature, she turned to Richard with tears in her bright blue eyes. "Is this really mine?" she asked. "Everything here is yours," Richard assured her, "and so much more. We're going to have a wonderful life together, Madison." That night, as Richard tucked Madison into her new bed, she looked up at him with the wisdom that had characterized their relationship from the beginning. "Uncle Richard, do you think my mommy and daddy know that I found you?" Richard felt his throat tighten with emotion. "I think they know, sweetheart. I think they're very happy that we found each other." "I'm happy too," Madison said sleepily. "It feels like coming home." 6 months later, Richard Sterling and Victoria Hartwell were married in a small ceremony in Richard's penthouse, with Madison serving as flower girl in a dress that made her look like the angel she had always been. Victoria had officially adopted Madison, giving her the complete family structure she deserved. The transformation in all three of their lives was remarkable. Richard had discovered that love, both for Madison and Victoria, made every success more meaningful and every challenge more manageable. Victoria had found the partnership she had always hoped for, both professionally and personally. And Madison was thriving in an environment where her intelligence, compassion, and natural leadership abilities were not just recognized, but celebrated. The little girl who had saved Richard's life with her courage and generosity had given him something far more precious than physical healing. She had given him a family, a purpose beyond building wealth, and the profound joy that comes from loving someone more than yourself. As Richard watched Madison reading bedtime stories to Victoria, he realized that the blood donation that had brought them together was just the beginning of a bond that would last forever. Madison had saved his life in the hospital, but she had also saved his soul, transforming a successful but empty existence into a life filled with love, laughter, and the endless possibilities that come from belonging to a real family. The Sterling family's story became one of Denver's most beloved tales of hope and redemption, proving that sometimes the most precious gifts come from the most unexpected sources, and that love truly can heal even the deepest wounds of the heart.